Very good. This is NYU time, 5 minutes. Another happy and exciting day at the Jordan Center as a happy semester approaches its end. And we have today a colleague who's from, technically from East Asian history, and is actually from East Asian history, but that includes the lands of the former Soviet Union and the Russian Federation, and having written a wonderful first book, which is coming out when?
By the end of this year.
By the end of this year, a calendar year.
Yes.
Nice. And we'll be back to celebrate that. There will be, she's beginning already to work on her second project. And she's going to tell us about it today in an oral presentation without a text. So it should be an entertaining and relaxing time for everybody. Yes. Everybody.
Okay, thank you for coming.
And remember that the format is, you know, it's an early stage.
Yes.
You're open to criticism, suggestion,
yeah.
so on. Right.
All right, thank you for coming and thank you for inviting me. And as Yanni said, I'm a historian of modern Japanese history, and this is my new project. And while I was writing my first book, which is titled "Revolution Goes East: Imperial Japan and Soviet Communism," I examined in that book the Russian Revolution and the impact of the revolution on the Japanese Empire. And in writing that book, I had to deal with the Russo-Japanese relations, in particular, this very intense and complicated relationship between Imperial Russia and Imperial Japan in the late 19th century, the Russo-Japanese War, the conflicts over the Chinese Eastern Railway, the Japanese intervention into the Russian Revolution between 1918 and 1925, and the Norman Hunt, right, the clashes on the Manchurian Mongolian border and Manchurian Soviet border in the late 19th century, and finally the Neutrality Pact, the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of April 1941. So while doing that research, so it became increasingly obvious to me that Soviet-Japanese or Russo-Japanese relations are not just about dividing the sphere of influences and dividing the territories. So on the surface, there was nothing more dissimilar than the Soviet Union, right, with its socialist planned economy, an emerging military bureaucratic regime, and Imperial Japan, on the other hand, with its anti-communist, neo-traditionalist, conservative monarchical order. And yet, despite these obvious and significant differences, I think comparison between these two regimes could yield some interesting discussions. So comparing these two empires, can possibly generate some new frameworks to understand not only the nature of the Japanese empire, but also the relationship between the nation, or between the state and different nationalities within Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. So this is a huge, and as I said, I'm just at the beginning, it's a huge and complex question, and in the next few minutes I will just kind of sketch sort of my ideas and my basic framework. The Soviet Union and Imperial Japan converged in the Mongolian territories, and the Mongolian territories is Buriatia, Outer and Inner Mongolia, which were geopolitically highly important and served as buffer zones between Soviet Russia and Japanese-occupied Republic China, and this is Manchuria, Manchukuo. As Soviet Russia came to control Buriatia and Outer Mongolia, Japan established its dominance in Inner Mongolia and Manchuria in the 30s. Both regimes, I argue, promoted a set of modernizing policies which were surprisingly similar. So facing the same problem of how rapidly to modernize the backward Mongols, Russia and Japan developed top-down, state-centered nationalist policies with varying degree of success. So the Soviet-Japanese relations, if you look at a standard textbook, a standard books that written, the history of these relations has been viewed as history of conflict, ideological and military. But the comparative study of these two regimes has yet to be written. So current scholarship, kind of following the basic division, sort of geographical territorial division of the area studies, right, divide these Mongolian territories, and Buriatia and Outer Mongolia has been usually studied within the Russian studies, right? Actually, if you look at the East Asian studies, or if you go to the Association of Asian Studies, there is no one who is presenting on Soviet Mongolia, right? Soviet Mongolia is usually included in the ACES, and vice versa, right? So this kind of artificial distinction between the communist bloc, right? Communist bloc where Buriatia and Outer Mongolia belong, and anti-communist bloc is Republican China and Inner Mongolia and Manchuria. So this kind of artificial distinction prevented sort of scholars from identifying strategies and policies that great powers, both the Soviet Union and Japan, regardless of their ideological preferences, deploy in dealing with small people caught in these regional power struggles. So in Japanese studies, it has become increasingly clear that to understand the Japanese empire and the nature and logic of the Japanese empire and its repertoire, as Jane and Fred would say, one needs to study Japanese notions of ethnicity, race, state, and relations with non-Japanese people before the modern period, right? Before the establishment or the emergence of the Japanese empire. So recently, scholars even argue that the Japanese colonial administration in China emulated to some degree or was built upon the colonial practices of the Qing Empire, the Chinese Empire. And although I'm less familiar with with the debates in Russian studies, but here too, it seems recent scholarship looks at the longue durée and perceives the Soviet Union not as a radically new imperial project, but considers it within the context of long-term challenges and continuities. So having said that, I will start with the Mongol Empire. So in 1203, Genghis Khan united the Altaic-speaking nomadic tribes under the name of Mongols. But the Mongol Empire, the biggest empire in world history, crumbled by the end of the 14th century due to internal fighting among Mongol rulers and nobility. By the end of the 17th century, the Qing dynasty, the Qings were, they were not Han Chinese, but the Manchu, coming from the Manchuria. So the Qing Manchu dynasty established control over what is known as Inner and Outer Mongolia. And Outer Mongolia, I don't know if you know why it's Outer Mongolia, it's just because it's far, yeah. So at the same time, so this is interesting, this is Chinese map. This is Chinese map of the sort of Qing dynasty, the territory of the Qing dynasty. So you notice, this is Kazakhstan right now. Right, so at the same time, the Russian Cossacks were reaching, so it's the early 17th century, Russian Cossacks were reaching eastern Siberia and establishing their outposts, claiming authority over the territory and its people. So in a series of treaties between Imperial Russia and Qing Empire, the Mongolian territories and its people were divided or split between the Russian and Chinese empires. So later, after the Qing Empire lost 2 opium wars, right, in the 1840s and 1850s, the Russians moved further, and they first acquired this territory in light green, and then in 1860, after the Treaty of Peking, what is now known as the Maritime Province, right? So this is the Russian Far East, became part of the Russian territory in the 1860, and in 1860 Vladivostok was established, the city, and the translation is the rule of the East, right? This is this is just for fun. This is a map from a Chinese school textbook. And this is, you notice here, in red, right? Red designates the territory of the Qing Empire. Oh, sorry, the contemporary Chinese state, the borders. But they claim the territory that is, the pink. It is interesting. Buriatia, right? Outer Mongolia and then Buriatia and Outer. This is all like the Chinese claim that was originally Chinese territory.
Meaning it's a claim today?
Yeah, it's claimed today. Yeah. I mean, it's not that they want them, those territories. It's just that the Chinese traditionally had control over those territories, which is not absolutely true. Okay. So this is the map of Asiatic Russia, North Asiatic Sea. So what's now called Transbaikalia, right, territory east from Lake Baikal, Transbaikalia, was populated by Mongol, the Buriat-Mongols, right? Now, after the Second World War, the second part Mongols was dropped, and now it's just Buryats. So these Buriat-Mongols who populated territory around Baikal were the most numerous and most unified of all ethnic minorities in the Siberian part of the Russian Empire. They mounted a prolonged and bloody resistance to Russian colonization in the 17th and 18th century. The standard narrative, right, is of course that the Buryats welcomed the incorporation of their territories into the Russian Empire and peacefully coexisted with the Russian settlers. The abuses of the Russian officials and settlers became so notorious that in the early 19th century, the government took some measures and implemented a series of reforms. And what is known as the Spiransky reforms of 1822 granted peoples of Siberia, not only the Buryats but also other peoples of Siberia, great degree of self-governance, which was largely in place until the end of the 19th century. But in the late 19th century, there are major changes right, in the full kind of territory of Russian Empire, and these changes brought great havoc to the region. So aggressive colonization of eastern Siberia. There are 6 million people arrived in 5 years. So aggressive colonization of eastern Siberia by Russian peasants from western parts of Russia, accompanied by aggressive Russification policy, forceful religious conversion, liquidation of self-governing bodies, the Steppe Duma, construction of the Siberian, Trans-Siberian Railroad, which brought even more people to the region. All of that caused great conflicts between the Buryats and the Russian settlers, largely focused on land rights. So by 1917, the population of Transbaikalia was comprised of 70% Russians and 30% Buryats. So I have to add that at the same time as Russian settlers are coming in millions to their territory, right, to the eastern Siberia, on the other side of the border, the Qing Empire also changing its policy and lifting the ban on migration of Han Chinese to the Mongolian territories. So before there was a ban, no one could migrate. Han Chinese could not migrate to the Mongolian territories. All that land and pasture was for the Mongols. But now there is aggressive colonization at the same time going on the other side of the border. And around 20 million Han Chinese, 20 million, right? Around even more, migrated within a decade. And so on the other side of the border, there is also great conflicts between the Mongols and Han Chinese. In 1911, however, the Qing Empire collapsed, and in its place emerged the Republic of China from 1912. And using this opportunity of the collapse of the empire, Outer Mongolia declared its independence. There were a back and forth, but finally the Outer Mongolia became an independent sort of nation state in 1921, with the help of the Russians, of course, and Outer Mongolia became the Mongolian People's Republic, and the first Soviet satellite state, even before what happened later in Eastern Europe. So a couple of, before I move to the kind of the Japanese side, I mean how Japan and its empire fits into this picture. So there are two key moments. One is the border between Russia and China was never enforced. And migration of families and larger groups continued in both directions. So there were, like, when the Russians came, first Russian settlers came, huge migration of Buryats to Manchuria. In the beginning, when aggressive colonization again, another wave. After 1917, after the Russian Revolution, there is another wave of migration. And there are, I mean, it's just steppe, right? There are no border guards, and there are no fences. So people just, whole villages were just eaten up and moving. And the last wave was at the late 28, 29, with the start of collectivization. So the border was finally kind of reinforced, and the fence was built, and the border guards appeared with guns and tanks when the Japanese army occupied Manchuria in 1931 and established Manchukuo. So this is one moment, right, that the border was open, sort of open. People were moving. And the second moment is religion. From the mid-17th century, Tibetan Buddhism spread around Trans-Baikal region, culturally uniting Buryats with Mongols and Tibetans. And Buddhism was responsible for a relatively high level of literacy among Buryats if you compare with other minorities. So many monasteries, Lama schools, libraries, and Tibetan medical schools were open in Trans-Baikalia. It was very common for young boys to travel and live in India, or travel to Lhasa and study there and come back from India to Buriatia and work in monasteries. So my final remark is that what makes this Buriat-Mongol case special is their geographical position. They lived on the borderland territory adjacent to another empire, the Qing and later the Japanese Empire. And so being on this geopolitically highly important territory worked at times for them and at times against them. Right? Related to that, Buddhism made the Buryats belong to a wider Asian community, like wider Asian Buddhist community. And there was a significant cultural, intellectual, and material connection to Asia, which again worked sometimes for them in favor of the Buryats and sometimes against them. Because there was always, in Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, there was always anxiety in the center, right, about the sort of loyalties of these borderland people. So because the Buriat-Mongol loyalty to the ethno-cultural entity, right, the bigger Mongol community and bigger Buddhist Asian community. So there was always like questioning if loyalty to the imperial state or Soviet state would not be undermined, yes, undermined by this bigger world that can go beyond, right, the borders of the state. So after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the Russian Empire disintegrated into several self-governing entities, and between 17 and 1919, there was a quite significant national independence movement in Buryatia, which initially advocated a complete cessation of the Buriat-Mongol territories from the Russian territory and establishment of an independent Mongolian state. So this movement is known as a pan-Mongolist movement, and it was led by the Buryat intellectuals or intelligentsia, an emerging intelligentsia, and they envisioned the unity of Buriatia, Outer Mongolia, and Inner Mongolia. All these Mongolian territories. You can ask about the Kalmyks. Right? If you know the Kalmyks, they live in western part of Russia. They saw that the whole kind of Kalmyk minority would move to this territory. And in their efforts, they asked the help of the Japanese military. And this is how the Japanese come into the picture, because of course the Japanese at this time, from 1918, they are part of the foreign intervention into the Russian Revolution, and the Japanese interventionist forces are on the territory of Buriatia. It's actually, they occupy from Lake Baikal Actually, Irkutsk was the most western point until Vladivostok, all along the Trans-Siberian Railroad. There were talks, there were a lot of things were happening, but at the end, the Japanese military withdrew their support, and they withdrew their support under the pressure of the Chinese warlords and Chinese Republican officials who were very unhappy, who were very concerned with the Mongolian independence movement. And so they pressured the Japanese to withdraw their support, and they did. This is the picture of some Buriats. This is medical school. So in 1920, the Bolshevik, the Red Army was, everyone knows the Civil War, right? Finally the Red Army reached the territory of Buryatia and they established their regime. And these Buriat, pan-Mongolist, pro-independence sort of leaders, they threw in their lot with the Bolsheviks. Not least because the Bolsheviks actively promoted the slogans of national self-determination and promised that the Buriat-Mongols, there will be some sort of autonomy, some sort of independence of Buryatia. So under the pressure of pan-Mongolist Buriat political leaders, the Russian Bolsheviks agreed to establish the Buriat-Mongol Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. And you see it here, here in 1923. So the Buriats were appointed to the highest positions in the new administration. They were also appointed to the highest position in the newly established Mongolian People's Republic, which was established next year, 1924. So in Mongolia, right, in Mongolian People's Republic, it was the Buriats who took positions of Minister of War, Minister of Education, Minister of Culture, Minister of Finance, and other important positions. There is I need to look at this more, but there is a theory that the Moscow promised Buriats that Outer Mongolia would become either part of the Soviet Union or Buriatia would be kind of independent and would become part of Outer Mongolia. So there were these talks. And Buriatia was very important for the Bolsheviks because it was supposed to be sort of this post-republic, a post-child, right, a showcase for Tibet. It's interesting for Tibet, for Outer Mongolia, and for Central Asia as well, and in general for kind of Buddhist Asia. Buriatia was also supposed to be a Platzdarm. They use this word Platzdarm for world revolution in the Buddhist East. And this is a more familiar story, right? How the new Bolshevik state promoted national language, how they opened schools, how there was a special decree that all the language of the administration should be Buriat. In 1926, there were only 7% of Buriat officials in the Buriat government. Only 3 years later, in 1929, almost 40% of the officials in the Republic of Buriatia were Buriats. The main city, the capital of Buriatia, was Verkhny Udinsk, and it was a Russian name. In 1934, it was renamed into Ulan-Ude, so it's specifically like Buriat name was given instead of Russian. For example, in 1930, there were only 2 textbooks of the Buriat language. Only 1 year later, there were 16 textbooks. So I can go on with this kind of, and of course, active industrialization. This is a movie. This is actually made by the Lenfilm, right? But this is a 1936 is in Mongolia, south of Mongolia, a story about a Mongol from the Republic, and this is obviously a Japanese officer.
Did you see the movie?
No, it's actually, it was just found like 2 years ago, so very recently. Okay. So I will skip since this is the sort of new political elite series, Buriat, Soviet Buriatia. This is first sort of tractors, mechanized. This is the meeting of women, socialist women. Oh, by the way, this is the Mongolian script on the top, which was used until 1931. So that was official 1960. This is Ulan-Ude, Верхний Удинsk in late 20s. So, Japan. In 1868, the Meiji Revolution ended the military-led, samurai-led Tokugawa regime and established a new sort of modern state apparatus with the emperor as at its head, but in reality, the state, the government was run by the was concentrated in the hands of political and military elite who came themselves from the samurai class. So after the Meiji Revolution, the Japanese sort of embarked on this imperial expansion. They acquired Taiwan. After the first Sino-Japanese War, they acquired Taiwan, Formosa, and as it was called, in 1895. Korea became a Japanese colony in 1905 after the Russo-Japanese War. But the Japanese, and since 1920s, the Japanese aggressively moved on the territory of Manchuria. So it was the kind of expansion into Manchuria was originally a military takeover, but very soon came the colonial administration and they began drawing plans of how to organize this new territory. And imagine, this is Northeast China. There are like dozens of different ethnicities live. Of course, the majority were Han Chinese, but there were Kazakhs, there were Tungus, there were Buriat-Mongols, there were Manchus. And the Japanese had this conundrum, like how to rule these people, how to organize them, considering that the Japanese, the Japanese were more or less sort of homogeneous ethnic group of people, right? And they never ruled until like 1870s. They didn't have this experience of ruling as a ethnicity or as a minority. So they came up with this idea of pan-Asianism, pan-Asianism or unity of all Asian people. The main sort of slogan or motto of the empire in China was the harmony of 5 races. So the Manchukuo that they established in 1932 was envisioned as this paradise state, as a utopian state where there will be ethnic and social harmony, ethnic and social equality. So this is Manchuria. The territory of Manchuria. Interesting. So Manchuria, this is a Western way to designate this territory. The Chinese, the Manchu themselves, they don't call this territory Manchuria. This is Manchuria, Mongolia. And if you look at this whole territory, 40% of Manchuria, what is here, right? It's in red. It's actually 40% is the Mongolian territory. It says 40% is Inner Mongolia. And the Japanese call that territory not Manchuria, but Manchuria, Mongolia, Manmo. So for the Japanese colonial administration, Mongols, and again I argue, occupied a special place in the empire. And why? And I find the answer is the same as it was for the Soviet state, because they are borderland people, right? The Japanese had to work hard on winning the loyalty of these Mongols, in maintaining them as a sort of bulwark against the Russians. The matter was even complicated because the borders were very porous, right? That people couldn't just get up and leave. And they also wanted to, as the Soviets on the other side, they wanted to create this utopian state as a showcase, right, for the Mongols on the other side of the border, to show, like, you know, this is an ideal state. This is a a very modernized, industrialized state, and kind of win loyalty of people in the place and invite people. Because there were this is like territory in red, right? But they had plans, the military especially, to invade Outer Mongolia. There were plans to invade Outer Mongolia and journey to Manchukuo. Right, I think I will, just becoming too long, so my talk. To finish, and this is like this is kind of my next step, what I will do next year. I will look at several issues, and this is where the issues of how the Soviets and the Japanese, what kind of policies they implemented towards the Mongols, and I will look at the education, the schools. I will look at the military, because both sides very actively conscripted, right, or enrolled the Mongols into their armies. I will also look at the political institutions that they established. Yeah, I think. That's all. Yeah, the final note. The major difference between the Imperial Japan and the Soviet Union, of course, is that Imperial Japan collapsed in 1945, and the Soviet Union existed for another half a century. But the so-called Mongol question, right, what to do with the Mongols and their sort of very special geopolitical position, was inherited by communist China. And communist China, in formulating its ethnic policies, very heavily relied on the Japanese experience, right, and as well as on the Soviet model, and so the picture becomes really even more complicated, because we look at the post-war period and also the Chinese organization, right. Managing of all these different people.
So you'll take it into the 50s?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Okay, so I will finish here.
That's fascinating. It's very brave of you to present at such an early stage. Thank you.
Yeah.
Could I ask you a technical question before we open the floor? So what languages of research are you using for the most part?
Japanese, for now Japanese and Russian.
Japanese and Russian?
Yeah, so.
And Mongol?
No, not yet. No, I would like to.
Are there sources?
There are sources, yes, there are sources. Yes, I need to. This is a very nice postcard from a new nation, new state. And it's supposed to be a Japanese and Chinese one.
So I'm interested in how you were characterizing the showcase state that the Japanese wanted to create. Could you say more about what its attributes were? What was specifically, like, you used the term utopia several times, and so that was interesting. What was utopian
This is
about it? Do you have a
this,
sense of that yet?
Yeah, that's what they said. It's not my.
Oh, I'm sure, and that's what.
They always use paradise on earth. The word paradise and utopia. Mainly, they like to point out how oppressive were Han Chinese, and how oppressive were the Russians, the Tsarist Russians. I mean, Russian settlers. They're talking to these Outer Mongolians, so in comparison, they argued, right? This state will have an ethnic harmony. Everyone will have an equal rights, equal privileges, and also economic and social and political equal rights. So that was utopic. Plus the project of industrialization or modernization. Manchukuo was an extremely so by the 1940s, it was a very modern, a very industrialized state, state territory. I mean, they created in 1935. They built the state-of-the-art sewage system in Manchuria. And there were, I like to say to my students, there were air conditioners in 1935 all over Manchuria, in big cities in Manchuria. Air conditioners in 1935. Airports, railroads, the network of railroads.
Does Louise Young go into the ethnic part?
Louise Young, she has a chapter on that, yes, because it's a big deal, this racial harmony. And they always like to, it's not only Tsarist Russia, the United States. That was another example, how bad is, the Western, Manchuria was envisioned as like anti-Western also, let's say, in comparison with what's going on with Westernized racism and American racism.
I so enjoyed all of this, and I wanted to ask an easy question, which is that you gave us a very full sense of what you're going to be moving towards, and I wanted to get a bit of a sense of what you want to move away from. Is it simply just the absence of material on this in the English language, or is it that there is material in various languages that you think is telling this story wrong? I mean, I kept thinking as you were speaking, what's out there, right? Is this woman jumping into something that's totally new in English, or is she, I'm guessing there's some in Russian, some in Japanese, etc. But what is it that you don't want to do?
So what has been done so far is to compare Mongols in Inner Mongolia, or less with Mongols from Outer Mongolia, to compare with to kind of discuss their relations with the Japanese Empire. I want to tell what I'm doing is I look at the Buriat-Mongols from Soviet Russia, from Imperial Russia, and these Buriat-Mongols, they traveled to Manchuria, to Manchukuo, actually, Japanese occupied Manchuria. And they, so this is, I didn't mention, sorry, in my text. After the Russian Revolution, there were thousands of Buriats who immigrated from the Russian territory to Manchuria, and they ended up in Manchukuo. So thousands of them enrolled in the Manchurian Imperial Army. And they were responsible for guarding the border between Soviet Russia and Manchukuo. And they were a perfect force because they were multilingual. They knew Russian, they knew Mongol, they knew, most of them knew Chinese, and they also they were learning very actively Japanese language. So there were several these Buriats who immigrated from the Russian territory until 1917, who actually reached rank of generals in the Manchurian Imperial Army. So my project is actually look at these people who were fighting the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War, lost, and moved to Manchuria and began to work for the Japanese in the 1930s. They began to work, and they were so anti-communist or anti-whatever, they had this that was the mission for them to fight the Bolsheviks, and they did it with the Japanese. And the Japanese also lured them, attracted them with this idea that we are Buddhists, you're Buddhists. They were very religious, of course, that we are Buddhists, we are Asians, and we will treat you fairly and equally, unlike the Russians did. Yeah. So my project is to trace the life of this. Actually, I will look at, my starting point is Buriat-Mongols, pro-independent sort of people in Buriatia, and then 1917 there were two lines. One moved to Outer Mongolia and stayed in Outer Mongolia, and they actually, so one group stayed in Soviet Russia, they became communist. Another group moved to Outer Mongolia, they were also communist, but let's say communist / nationalist. And then the third group, they moved to Manchukuo. And so I want to compare all these three groups, sort of the lives and fates, the destinies of these three groups. And I will finish in 1950 and see what happened to them. It's not a spoiler to say that they all ended badly, right? The Buryats who stayed, actually this national, who were pan-Mongolists, in the 1938, 1937, they ended up executed. 90% of political leadership were executed in 1938. This Buryat-Mongol Republic was broken into three pieces. And of course it's related to the creation of Manchukuo, because the Soviet leadership were very, very concerned with having Manchukuo at the border, and there is this Buriat-Mongols, and you know, they passed, they were all pan-Mongolist / Japanese spies. That was the accusations. Outer Mongolia, there was another ethnic cleansing actually. Ethnic cleansing by Choibalsan and cleansing of the Buryats. Again, Buryat leadership in Mongolia. And those who ended up in Manchukuo, they were arrested in 1945 by the Soviet army, and the top leaders were executed in Moscow. So those Buryat generals of Manchukuo Imperial army, they were transferred to Moscow and executed there.
Well, can we go back to an earlier part of the story, and that's the early 30s. So could you say something about what the collectivization meant and the big Soviet campaigns, 29, 31, 32, in this area and for Buryats and Buriat-Mongolia?
I think that it was like everywhere else. It was big conflicts, and people didn't know what it is. Like I just read this some official documents. They would bring all the cattle into one yard in the morning. It would stay there. No one was working, of course, because it's not theirs anymore. And then by the evening, the cattle would just go back to the families. Back to the families. So there was a lot of friction. There was a lot of resistance, of course, from the Russian peasants as well. Mostly from them. Many of them, were imprisoned because they protested. There was a wave of protests. I mean, even we can say an uprising was in 1929.
Did this mean more Buryats went to Japanese side in this period?
Yes.
Yeah, so you have an emigration from that period as well.
Yes, that was the last probably wave. In 2930, because then Manchuria was occupied by the Japanese.
Yeah.
Still more difficult.
Two questions, if I may. One is, did the Japanese view a lot of the cross-border Mongol Buryats with the same sort of suspicion that the Soviets do? Is this is this a particular Soviet paranoia, or is this a general national security? And do you get a sense of the development over time of how your actors identify themselves? Whether they're primarily identifying as Buriat-Mongols, and whether that might change over time and be a stronger identification with Soviet nationality policy, Japanese nationality policy? Or are they viewing themselves primarily as agents of these various empires? Because that's, in the previous century, that would be often the more normal way to view yourself.
No, so far I get the sense that they kept a strong international, this via Buriat-Mongols. In every group that I just mentioned, in all three groups. Yeah. Of course, people who stayed inside Soviet Buriatia, they were all sort of communists. Some of them were more eager, some of them less eager. But that Buriat-Mongolia, the Buriat-Mongols, this national identity was really strong. That disappears after the Second World War, but this is another story and I cannot say much about that. But until Second World War, that's, yeah, nationalism, let's say, was prevailing.
Could I ask, so if I'm to try to, I mean, it's early stages and you're to work throughout issues and so on and so forth, so this is just really a question. So the way I'm reading it is, so even in terms of the maps you're showing, you're recentering a lot of what we thought we knew. So you're having us concentrate there and then work outward from there rather than the reverse. Right?
Yes.
So you're not starting necessarily with geopolitics, but although that's obviously not part of it. So as part of that recentering, we begin to see things we wouldn't have otherwise seen. And would it be right to say that you're concerned with what someone might call agency, or what I would call instead, the sort of ways in which people are actively participating in systems, meaning this is a population. So I was thinking of Louise Young. So Louise Young is basically interested in projections onto Manchukuo, right? Whereas you're actually talking about local populations, among others, Mongols, who are actively doing things, right? Including becoming generals and being mobilized and being taught and going to school. Would that be part of what's different about what you think you're doing? Or?
Yeah, well, yes, I'm first recentering, like I'm going beyond this, borders, the maps, right? Putting the Mongols sort of at the center. And I'm ignoring these borders between Soviet Union and China, right? Or Japanese occupied China. So ideally it would be both ways. I haven't figured out. I don't want to write a history of Buriats, right? In that sort of very turbulent period. But at the same time, I don't want just simply to write history of Japanese Empire and Mongol culture. So I guess I want both ways. So to give the agency to these people, how they were co-opted and how they were happily co-opted, right, and participated in this and supported these imperial powers. But at the same time, I'm interested how Japanese look at the sort of Japanese empire as a whole and see, and this I'm in conversation with historians of Japan, that we cannot, what they did in Taiwan, right, is different from what they did in Mongolia. And why was it different? That there were differences in the repertoire of the empire. Yes, and why the Mongols were different is because they are very close to the Nazi Empire. Yeah.
Well, it seems to me it's a wonderful inter-empire story.
Yeah.
And just as in your title, you suggest, so there is a group of people that, as Brendan's saying, they classically could play both sides and so on. But then you mentioned in this sort of 1919 moment, then there's this outburst of Mongol, I would call it imperialism too, because it was supposed to be very big. So one of my questions is, and one of the things that I think is radical here is that instead of just having your Cold War story of communism, anti-communism, what you seem to be really emphasizing is ethnic politics, ethnic cultural politics, on the part of both empires, right? So how did, you've spoken a bit about the ethnic harmony notion in Manchukuo, but how did the people at the time think about that in comparison with the Soviet notion that, after all, they created a Mongolian People's Republic, and they validate Mongol ethnicity as they validate other ethnicities. It's different. It's not harmony per se, but
On the Soviet side.
yeah, on the Soviet side. But maybe this is one way to think about the different repertoires of the empire, but particularly from the way these Buriats interpret their possibilities in cultural ethnic terms that the two empires are offering. Your communists, for example, the communist Buriats, did they criticize let's say, the fake ethnic harmony of the Japanese? Did they validate did they pay attention to Soviet ethnic national policy. And did they write about it, talk about it? Was that one card to play or not?
Yeah, unhappiness was on both sides. And very quickly, I mean, immediately they saw the fakeness of that, right? I read these memoirs of a very, kind of one of the top Japanese politician. He was complaining that this Russian chauvinism, Russian nationalism is not going away. And even in daily life, it's complaining they're constantly kind of snubbed by the Russians because they think they're more like educated than they are. And this is happening like, every day. And because the unhappiness is how they're being treated. And on the Japanese side as well, they said, yeah, the Japanese saying, Japanese is again complex because as I mentioned, they don't know how to govern these people. So they sort of created that they are all older brothers and they younger, younger brothers, the rest, right, who are less maybe capable of doing things, and the Japanese, of course, becomes the leader who needs to show them the way. And so there was inherently unequal relations, and of course the Mongols. And the Japanese also had this idea, their own idea of civilization, right? And the Mongols were really backward for them being compared with Chinese. And the whole policy was to modernize this back.
This is just a perhaps a tendentious connection, but I'm reminded listening to what you're describing, I'm reminded of what happened in the Caucasus from 1917 to 1923 or 24. And one of the things that's most notable, now again, this is not looking at military policy, but at other organs of the state. One of the things that's really notable about that period in general is the comparative inattention of the center to these particular border regions. The Caucasus is one of them, and the other is really what they're referring to in Moscow as the Far Eastern Republic. And I'm just thinking of the narrative I learned of, because what's happening in the Caucasus in this period is that there are a number of configurations that are imagined of what these three interconnected but distinct, what these dozens and dozens of interconnected but distinct ethnicities. There's also, and there are religious dimensions to this obviously as well, but what they might look like, including a trans-Caucasian federation, but a lot of creativity that collapses almost immediately as Moscow starts paying attention again. There's this vacuum that is allowed to persist so long as Constantinople or Istanbul and Moscow, as the centers are occupied with themselves, that then, they can just, and I'm curious, this is just thinking in terms of like the chronologies that you're building up. That might be a critical dimension to the story about what can flourish when there's a sense that's a sort of like, because again, and this is monetary policy, so this is really not at the heart of things, but it was really striking to me the extent to which, for years, up until the mid-1920s in Moscow, they're just sort of like, they have their own currency, we can't suppress it, it doesn't matter, we don't care, we'll deal with that later, So like what they can do, they can have their own currency, they can, do all kinds of things that might be possible.
That's why I started before the Soviet Union, the period, and looking really back and and how during the whole basically 19th century, for 100 years, the Buriat-Mongols were basically left alone by Moscow, right? They had the self-governing bodies, and they paid taxes, but there was no one to kind of supervise them daily. Another thing, interesting point is that what you're saying in Caucasus, right? It was like mid-20s, right? It finished this sort of creativity.
The creativity in terms of state formation finishes much sooner, but the actual determination that we're going to go in and like do something there doesn't really start to come in until the mid-20s. So they suppress the alternatives by 1921-22, depending on the place, but the real
we're going to build something isn't
What I
starting until
found very
25.
interesting in the case of Buriatia, right? So the river on the western part of Baikal, Irkutsk, there's more like Russian, like 80% probably Russians.
Yeah.
And they were very much against creating the the Buryat Soviet Republic. And they petitioning, like we cannot have this huge republic. And Buryat language should not be the sort of main administrative language, so on. And they are fighting between this western part and eastern part. And Buryats really demanding that this big republic, big territory. So finally Moscow interferes and they support the Buryats. They support the Buryats and basically tells the on the western part of Irkutsk, the Russians just basically like
Yeah.
take off, right? They let them leave them alone. This is all like the formulation was we Russians oppressed them for centuries. Now
Right.
this is the time for them to flourish.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, but that's
this continues until 1931, until the establishment of Manchukuo. And I actually feel that the Japanese are a very important part of the story. Throughout 1920s, there is no interference. You know, the Buryats did what they wanted to do. Languages, you know, textbooks, every literature is flourishing, and so on.
But it,
Yeah.
but then it's flourishing like by itself, or it's flourishing because of like Soviet policy. Like, and it's like positive interference until this.
No, but like positive interference.
Yeah.
But basically, they created this republic, they created these institutions. You know, the question of monitor is important, I think. Where do they get money to publish the textbooks and establish schools all over, you know, villages? I need to look into that. But it's like great institutions that sort of left all this governing for the local.
It seems like the trade relations would also be extremely important. Trade, like if you're looking at that territory in particular, I know that like the Chinese, the trade with like ethnic Chinese even, or who are identified at least in the documents I'm reading as Chinese, would be significant.
Is there a great trade with China in the 1920s?
Between,
Russia, Soviet Russia and China, 1920s.
Not like in a formal sense. I'm not talking about formal delegations. I'm talking about as you
Stuff
just
going,
acknowledged.
yeah.
As you just said, the border is completely porous. And so if you're reading the finance journals of that period, there's a lot of talk for both the Caucasus and along the borders in the Far East of there being like really substantial black market.
Yeah, no, black market. The Russian Far East.
operations. I mean, but they're not black market in this period. I call them that to make clear the kind of like exchange I'm talking about, but it's not, it's like ooh, illegal.
unreported, unreported.
In the Russian Far East, after the Russian Civil War, 1923-24, there are like first surveys about the fishery business. 90% of fishery business in Russia is owned by the Japanese. In 1923. 90%.
Well, that's a big thing, though, is the Japanese, like they're very worried about the Japanese economic penetration over there.
Taking over. I mean, and the Russian Far East is like it's a thing in itself.
When you fight your war, it's right there, right? Japan and the Soviet Union.
it's
right there,
maritime. Maritime.
Oh, further over, further to the east?
The Civil War, right? All trans have been here. This is Irkutsk. The fighting between the Japanese and the Russians is all going along the Trans-Siberian, and mainly Vladivostok.
That's the Civil War.
Yes.
But what about the 30s?
And it's Naman Khan. So one was like around, here, Naman Khan.
Mhm.
This is Mongolian and Manchurian borders here, and another was around here.
So just one comment and one question. So one thing I would consider is how important collectivization is to this story, because I mean, this sounds a lot like Ukraine. This sounds a lot like Terry Martin's work in Ukraine, with the same sort of sudden shift and the same sort of international fears And this also coincides with collectivization in ways and the abandonment of the Piedmont Peninsula. But the question that I have is, in this presentation, and just in talking to you about this project, it's very clear what your questions are. And I'm curious what this is going to look like in terms of, is this going to be a history of institutions? Is this going to be a history of case studies of individuals? Because when you talk about the Japanese case, it seems to center very much on these individuals. When you talk about the Soviet case, you have the problem of the lack of continuity. And then if you're bringing in China and it's centered on individuals, I'm not sure where those individuals are coming from. Versus, is this going, or are you going to look at various types of institutions? I'm just trying to get a sense of, I mean, I understand what the questions are. I'm trying to get a sense of how the structure in which you're going to answer these questions.
Definitely not institutions, I guess. I think it would be like case study. I think I want to kind of just find people and several people and just trace their lives. Sort of more biographical approach. I know one, this general who was executed. He's very famous. He's actually one of the protagonists of a very famous Japanese manga. So the Japanese actually know him. So, and I think I will just find people and more like biographical approach.
He's like Elizabeth McGuire's.
Yeah, sort of like that.
But I think you're, as you always are, doing a lot more than you seem to tell us. Because, if you do, even if you take individual people and trace their trajectories, it seems to me that this book would tell us a lot about an inter-imperial situation in Asia, and that's where the recentering really matters. And getting away from this Eurocentric story. It has all these, not to say that the European situations aren't important, but for people to look at the inter-imperial context in this theater, and then to take a particular national group, in this case the Buriats, and tell their story about choices, constraints, and choices, and so on, and through them tell a story about policies of these two intersecting empires. I mean, I think that's what it's going to turn out. I mean, after all, remember, Willard Sunderland wrote a book. I never thought he could do it. Tell the whole story of the imperial part of the Russian Revolution with one figure. But he did it, and I think with the right choice of characters, you could probably tell a lot. It seems to me it's really important to have people on both sides of this border that you can carry through.
There's a temporal element to it, which is that, so you're dealing with a population which post facto we can identify as Buriat and Mongol, right? But at the beginning of your story, it's not quite clear what to call them, right? So it's sort of like, people write histories of the United States that begin in 1492. The history of the USSR that begins in 988, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's something fundamentally wrong with that, right? And it's the way we write history. Meaning it's a contradiction. And so, to look at it as, a pre-existing community and you know where it is and what it is obviously not what you're saying, you can't, right? Not in the earlier parts, certainly not even in the later parts. So this brings us back to contingency. Part of it, I think, what Jane is getting at. So you do have imperial presences, right? And you have, I'm counting 5 in total, right? 3 versions of China,
Yes.
3 versions of China, 2 versions of Russia in Soviet Union, and 1 version of, do I have that version? Is that 6?
Yeah, there were also Americans actually, but
Oh,
I
did
didn't
they
even
come into
touch
the
on them.
picture? Did they come into the picture?
Yes, they came.
Okay, so 7.
Because the Buriats actually wanted Americans first, but Americans sort of were not Korean, and then they went to the Japanese.
Okay. And so then you have people, right, who are moving as individuals and groups, and I think that's why the individual stories makes a lot of sense, right? But they're making choices, so it's not in the sense of rational choice. It's that in this situation I have these possibilities, right?
Yeah.
I'm enabled to do this, including becoming a high commander in the Japanese Imperial, the Manchurian Imperial Army, or a commissar, or
Yes,
and there's nothing predetermined.
Yeah.
So you know what I'm saying. So you take apart all sorts of assumptions and all sorts of trajectories at the same
Yeah,
time, and
yeah.
you destabilize them.
Yeah.
And in a sense, you're talking about a certain kind of freeing of the historian, of yourself and of us,
Uh-huh.
from, the history of the USSR, the history of Japan, and the
yeah.
history of, I think there's something refreshing about that.
Thank you.
But I do wonder, so how would you begin to call them in the early chapters of the book? Or how would you introduce the topics?
Yeah. Well, they call themselves Buriat-Mongols.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the
When,
Russians
when,
Huh?
when?
Since they were incorporated into the, this is a very unclear still question that where this name Buriat comes from.
Right.
So there is one theory that it was actually a Russian creation, that the Russians called these Mongols Buriats, and then Buriats began calling themselves Buriat-Mongols.
Yeah.
There is another version that actually existed before the Russians came, and these people who were around Lake Baikal Komzus. But it's and there are many tribes, and they identify, of course, themselves not with the bigger community, but with the tribe. Right? And there were like dozens of tribes around Lake Baikal.
So you're talking about the Russian Empire now?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what if you go into Outer and Inner Mongolia?
Mhm.
See, I don't have an
This is-
answer. I'm
Yeah,
wondering
yeah,
how
yeah.
you
No,
do
but
it.
the thing is, I think that's why the Mongol Empire becomes important, because the Mongol Empire, 13th century, right? They designated themselves. They began to call themselves Mongols. And that stayed, and that memory of the previous empire, the old empire, it was very strong, and it stayed until now. If you go to Mongolia, yes, especially now. Yes. But it stayed, and the name stayed, and it stayed from the 13th century. And interesting, the Buriat-Mongols, right? Even during this imperial period, they identified themselves as descendants of the entire Mongol. But it's good, But thank you for articulating better than me, my bigger framework. Yeah. It's like focusing on these people, but at the same going from there like this,
Well, we're always very origin stories when we're talking about a group of people or something like that, which is probably misplaced, right? Meaning we're forced to do that. We live in national entities, and we're paid by government entities. Our books are organized. But there's a moment where we can just free ourselves of that and say there is another way to look at it. And so rather than look at it as an origin story, you're talking about contingencies, really. Within certain boundaries, possibilities foreclosed, possibilities opened, choices made within a certain constricted range of possibilities.
This was how I got it. I was just amazed by the sort of what these people lived, and what was open, what was closed.
Well, the Buriat-Mongols that you're talking about are already existing in a context where the big powers recognize ethnic groups. So that's kind of the given from the late 19th century period. So let's say when you start, the Russians have a name for them, they have their name for themselves, and then the Japanese have to figure out a way of dealing with other peoples, and they know that there are these peoples and they have certain shared names or not. But I don't want you to lose track of, but one problem here, of course, is the they. And as you've shown, you've got a lot of you've got different actors who self-identify as Buriat-Mongols, and they have different goals. So it's not just what these people, meaning a people, experience, but really these people in the sense of individuals is the story that you're telling. But through that, it seems to me, it gets to this complexity of political choices. Now, the one group I'm very interested in is, as you had said explicitly, you have two modernization projects going on. Both these empires are claiming to modernize what they're doing. And first of all, we would need to have a kind of a political economy snapshot. How industrialized was which area, and how much is still, how much is nomadic, and how much is trade, and how much is agriculture. We need to see the sort of starting point. But if you think about these communist Buriats, they're in for modernization too. And we've talked a bit about the Korean ones and how divided they are on the Japanese project, because you go with Japan and international communism and you want to modernize. That's one very acceptable, understandable choice. You go for your national self-defense, then you take another path. But you've got people on both sides of this, kind of tricky border. Communists on both sides of the border, and they have to define themselves according to, or they at least do have to make choices in terms of this question of modernization. And communist ideology supposedly is telling them, you go with with the modernizing project. Or maybe that's not important. Maybe for some of them a much more important part of their goal is national rights and so on. But I think there's got to be it's not just the collectivization, but really the industrialization and collectivization, all these modernization projects on both sides of the border by two different political entities. I think that's really a great background story for then trying to figure out why different individuals make their choices. It won't be one Buriat way, in other words, it will turn out to be a multiplicity of possibilities and constraints ultimately in terms of the story.
But at least in terms of your generals end up all leading to one place. That's what initially reminded me of the Transcaucasian story, was the fact that when you're in between the powers,
The thing is that if you compare, the thing is that if you see after 1945, right? I mean, Buriat Republic is in place. It remained its territory, and the leadership still Buriat mainly. And so you don't say it's a success story, right? But they're still there. Looking at the other side of the board, what's going on in China, right? And the Japanese Empire, this is another question why the Japanese Empire collapsed, and then there is a way to look at this because they couldn't manage that. Their ideology of 5 races didn't work. They couldn't come up with universalizing ideology as the Soviets did. Successfully.
And also because that's why I asked the question about the utopias, because I think that's really interesting in terms of they don't mean the same thing. Like they're talking about utopia, but you use the word paradise even just now, which is not something that would have. So it will still be important to articulate the distinction between the modernizing projects. But it's going to end up looking pretty different. Is my gut.
No, the content
totally based in ignorance.
No, but you're right. The content is different, right? And again, the starting point is different because the Japanese were coming from their islands, this huge, already very complex territory, right? And the Russians were already there. There was a centuries of sort of experience of dealing with these people. And the Japanese, there is another story, this is a parallel story how they're modernizing, but there's also a story of the Japanese they're sending spies, they're studying and translating Soviet texts, and they're very interested in 5 years plan. They're trying to achieve they have their own 5-year plan, Manchukuo. Exactly, it's called 5-year plan. And they're studying not only industrialization process in Soviet, but they're also studying the nationality and trying to sort of kind of learn what's going on there.
That's really neat.
Language of race?
Language of race? What you mean in Manchukuo? They claim that the conversation is usually discussed on the level of ethnicity. Race was the same. We are all sort of, they use the word Tungus race, Tungus race, and there are different sort of families, different branches within that. And the Japanese branch, but the Japanese, Korean, and Mongols actually were in the same sort of most English family. Yeah, but the race was the same, and it was very important for them to say that we are all the same race. Interestingly, Han Chinese were excluded from that. Han Chinese were from something, not Tungus.
And the Europeans.
We are.
Good?
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much.
Thank
This is
you.
really cool.